Greetings, everyone. Shalom. So wonderful to walk this Essene Nazarean Ebionite path with y'all as we continue our work towards the restoration of the original tradition. I was very lucky this past weekend to participate in a baptism here in the North Georgia mountains, where I am currently. I'll be headed back to Chile in about a week to our retreat center there. But it was a really beautiful ceremony with some like-minded souls that reached out to me. And we had a lovely time, really felt God's presence and felt the Holy Spirit washing over us in the living waters as we performed the ritual baptismal purification using the Didache and its baptismal formula. In this video, I'll share with y'all a presentation that I gave as part of the master's degree that I'm working on in religious studies. And I wrote a paper, which I will link in the description. It's on my academia.edu page. So y'all can check that out if you want more details. It's a lot more detailed than what I'll present here. But essentially, I wanted to show the relationship between the Dead Sea Scrolls, in particular the Community Rule, or Manual of Discipline as it was once known, and the Didache. And I wish to tie a historical thread going all the way back to the group that composed the Community Rule in the first place, and the group that composed the Didache about 200 years, 250 years later, maybe, something like that, and show the commonalities between those two groups. Essentially, they were the same group, I believe. The group evolved, of course, especially after Yeshua, the true prophet, the true anointed one, or Messiah, came to earth. Obviously, that group evolved once the Messiah was born and taught and preached and all of that. Okay, but it was essentially the same group. In other words, we can say that Yeshua inherited a tradition. He did not create a tradition, but was a leader within a pre-existing tradition that we can call the Nazarean Essenes, a particular subsect of Essenes that we can call the Nazareans, that later became known as the Ebionites, as that group came to be led by James the righteous, or James the just, Yeshua's brother, and then later on by another brother, possibly cousin, but more likely another brother of Yeshua named Simon, or Simeon, who went on to lead the Ebionites after James was martyred around 63, 64 AD, something like that. And of course, that group settled on the other side of the Jordan River in the Transjordan in Pella, and also some of the other towns of the Decapolis, so-called, on the other side of the Jordan River and Sea of Galilee and all of that. Okay? But we can draw a straight line, a historical thread, going all the way back to these original Essene groups. We could call them the Nazareans, Nazarean Essenes. Okay, all the way through to the early Jewish Christians, which we can call the Ebionites if you want, that wrote the Didache between 70 and 100 AD. All right? And so, again, Yeshua inherited a tradition. He was a leader within a tradition that was already around when he was born. And so I'll tie a historical thread from the Community Rule, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, to the Didache, and show that it was essentially both texts were composed by a very similar group. Okay, and this is our foundation as part of this tradition, okay, of Essenes, Nazareans, Ebionites, and all of that, followers of the way, as it were. Okay, So the title of my paper, as well as this presentation, is A Source Critical Analysis of the Didache and Essene-inspired Jewish Christian Texts. I go into a lot of details about what source criticism is, the history of source criticism in the Old Testament and New Testament in my paper and all of that, so you can read that paper if you want to know more details. In 1873, Archbishop Philotheos Berenios, Metropolitan of Nicomedia, discovered a manuscript in the library of the Patriarch of Jerusalem at Constantinople. In this manuscript were a number of texts. None of them were more intriguing and paradigm-shattering than the Didache, also known as the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations. Its discovery put religious academia on notice, and what followed was a cavalcade of early interest and scholarship in the late 19th century. So the Didache is a very well-examined, well-researched, well-investigated ancient text, and there's been an awful lot of scholarship done on the Didache, or the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations, as it was originally known or titled. Okay, so within the Didache, especially the first 6 chapters, there is something that is known as the two ways tradition, or the two ways material, in the first 6 chapters of the Didache. Okay, if you don't have a copy of the Didache, you can find it easily online. It's also in my book, Yeshua the Anointed One, Pre-Pauline Christianity, which I'm revising right now, but you can still get a copy on Amazon and all that, but I'll have a newer copy with a lot more information and all of that coming out within the next year or so. But I do have a copy of the Didache in there, along with the Gospel of Thomas, Q, and the Epistle of James. So, a method of moral exhortation used in the Didache and other church documents for purposes of moral catechesis. And so the Didache begins, there are 2 ways, one of life and one of death, and proceeds to describe behaviors that foster life and excoriate conduct that leads to destruction and death. Okay, so talks about the way of life and the way of death. It makes this spiritual path very simple and practical. Okay, and so, there's so much noise in the world today as it regards spirituality, religion, and just information overload. So one thing that I've really been working on is just trying to simplify matters. The Didache does a really wonderful job of that. You don't need to read a million texts to really understand the message of Yeshua, the message of the Essenes, the Nazarenes, Ebionites, the original way. Okay, it's very succinct within the pages of the Didache. Okay, a way of life, a way of death. All right, and the Dead Sea Scrolls talks about the way of light, the way of darkness, and all that. Okay, it's the same 2 ways tradition. All right, and actually, in the Didache, you're really supposed to read all of that information about the 2 ways prior to the baptism ceremony, and so you essentially ask people to commit to the way of life, the way. And then you baptize, you have a Eucharist, you can break bread afterwards, drink grape juice and all that. And the Didache also has the original Eucharist in it, okay? The original Lord's Prayer, the original baptismal formula. Actually, the baptismal formula is a bit watered down, no pun intended. But the Lord's Prayer is good, the Eucharist is good, for sure. And the Eucharist has none of the blood sacrifice, blood atonement, symbolism that Paul invented, that we find in 1 Corinthians for the first time, which he said he received by direct transmission from Yeshua himself. So he channeled this all this blood sacrifice nonsense. He tells us in 1 Corinthians. But the Didache preserves the original Eucharist symbolism, which was simply the wine or grape juice, really, symbolized the vine of David. So Yeshua's genealogy, his heritage and all that, as the Messiah and whatnot. And And the bread symbolizes unity and oneness, the oneness of the community, but also our oneness with the Lord, our yoke to the Lord, our oneness, okay, with God, our oneness as a Christian community, and all of that, okay, because the grains, are many, but when you break the grains down, pulverize the grains, and then you bring it together in the dough, you're creating one bread, one loaf of bread out of many grains and all of that. So the symbolism is really just the vine of David or Yeshua's kingly, priestly lineage, heritage, genealogy, and all that. And by the way, I'm not sure Yeshua was necessarily, from David's line. I mean, pretty difficult to prove, but it seems like his followers definitely believed that. And so that's okay, that's fine. And again, the bread symbolizes oneness. All right. So there's some other texts that incorporate the two ways, and y'all can look up this scripture if you'd like. And as a matter of fact, the Epistle of Barnabas, the original scholars that studied the Didache believed that the Epistle of Barnabas was possibly a source text for the Didache. That was disproven later because the Epistle of Barnabas was written later than the Didache, so that would have been impossible. Probably the other way around. All right. So the aim of this paper, which again y'all can read, I'll link it in the description below on my academia page. The aim of this paper is to show how source criticism has been used to identify sources in a non-canonical 1st century CE text known as the Didache. I'll provide a synopsis of the scholarship regarding the source criticism of the Didache, in particular the first 6 chapters of the Didache containing the two ways tradition. I will conclude by showing that the community rule from the sectarian literature found in Qumran was the primary source used in Didache chapters 1 through 6. Furthermore, I hope to demonstrate that the Cave 4 manuscript of the community rule represents an earlier Essene tradition that existed prior to the Qumran breakaway sect of Zadokite priests, and that this earlier tradition better represents what later became the Jewish Christian community responsible for the composition of the Didache. I know it's complicated, but there's a lot of nuance there, and so I would encourage you to read the paper in full if you want more details, but essentially the community rule or manual of discipline or community rules has several different translations. The title is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, part of the so-called sectarian literature from Qumran. Okay, and there are variants of the community rule. Most of the manuscripts were found in Cave 1, and they contain, they're much longer, and they contain information about the Zadokite priests or the sons of Zadok, and that was an insertion, later insertion, really a redaction that replaced the congregation, Ha-Rebim. I'll explain all this, okay? Most scholars who studied the Didache early on believed that it used Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, and the Epistle of Barnabas as sources for its composition. But the Epistle of Barnabas was written in 150 CE, about 50 years at least later than the Didache, and Matthew in its final form was not really circulating widely at the time of the Didache's composition. Matter of fact, after reading James Edwards' book about the Hebrew Gospel, I'm convinced that Luke came before Matthew, and that Matthew was probably written more like around 90 AD-ish. Okay, and so actually, yeah, it was not really in wide circulation at the time of the Didache's composition. And so the Didache, in its original form, most primitive form, most likely predates Matthew, and was probably written around the time of Mark and the early stages of Luke, let's say. Okay, but written shortly after the Hebrew Gospel was written, probably around 70 AD. Okay, so some researchers argue for an early date for the Didache. For example, William Varner makes a persuasive case for a date of 70 CE or AD based upon 5 key criteria. So, long story short, most scholars date the Didache to around 100 AD, but some researchers think it was much earlier, like William Varner, for example. So, the primitive simplicity of the Didachists' teaching about the person and work of Jesus, the absence of any warning about specific doctrinal aberrations, the continued existence of itinerant apostles and prophets. That's so key, that third one, okay? Because a lot of that went away, later on. So that really demonstrates that this text is quite early, quite primitive. A simple pattern for the church's leadership, overseers and deacons, and its silence about any persecution experienced by its readers or writers, which would have been mentioned, had the text been written later, especially after the destruction of the temple, the persecution of Jews by the Romans, and all that, from 70 on and whatnot. So I tend to date the Didache very early. Okay. Jonathan Draper is really a key figure in Didache scholarship. He's probably the world's most preeminent Didache scholar. So no one has written and published more than Jonathan Draper, who's considered one of the world's most preeminent Didache scholars. In fact, according to Wilhite, it could be argued that Jonathan Draper is the most influential voice in English-speaking Didache scholarship. His influence is far-ranging. Draper's influences touch nearly every publication, presentation, or discussion about the Didache in English scholarship over the past 35 years. All right. So Draper demonstrated that the Didache is independent of the Synoptic Gospels. So in other words, the Synoptic Gospels were not sources for the Didache. The Didache's Jesus tradition shares a similar Jewish setting that also finds its way into the composition of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew, Luke, and the Didache use a common source. I put Q here. Again, I know it's a hypothetical source, okay, which is still fluid and formed during the first century. As Draper suggests, the Didache represents the community rule of the Matthean community that is in a process of development. So it is true that the Didache and Matthew were probably both written in the same general area, geographically, and, possibly during the same time period and all of that. But again, I believe that the Didache was used as a source for Matthew and not the other way around. Okay. So in his dissertation, which I believe was from like 1980, early 80s, Draper states that the community rule and the Didache derive from roughly the same era, since the scrolls are, by general consent, to be dated somewhere between 150 BC and AD 68, while Didache is now usually believed to have received its final redaction about 100 AD. Okay, they derive also from the same geographical area and from the same general milieu of heterodox Judaism. Draper, in his comparison of the two ways material and the Didache with the community rule, uncovered a number of interesting parallels and the list of virtues and vices, etc. So there are a lot of parallels between the community rule and the Didache. Draper is not the only scholar that has observed this commonality between the two texts. Many scholars believe that the community rule was used as a source text for the Didache. Okay, meaning that the compositors of the Didache had access to the community rule and were familiar with the two ways tradition from the Dead Sea Scrolls and from the Essenes. Okay? So, the pre-Qumran Essenes, who were they? The Essenes, as described by Philo and Josephus in their historical documents, are thought to have been a group of peace-loving, vegetarian mystics who were opposed to war, slavery, and animal sacrifice. They were said to be 4,000 in number and spread about ancient Palestine. However, the sectarian literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran paints a very different picture. Furthermore, the archaeological evidence demonstrates that the harsh environment and limited facilities of the Qumran settlement could sustain only a minority of the 4,000 Essenes. Obviously, the majority of Essenes lived elsewhere. As a matter of fact, and that comes from Gabriele Boccaccini, an Italian scholar I highly recommend to read his book Beyond the Essene Hypothesis. It's fantastic. He goes into a lot of the evidence that shows that the Essenes were essentially Enochian Jews. I've come to the conclusion that most of the Essenes were really groups that came from the Transjordan area. And that's why you see in some of the sectarian literature from Qumran, they always use Damascus as a sort of cipher for Qumran. And so they refer to Qumran as Damascus because probably, that's where they came from and all that. But at any rate, so I tend to see the Essenes now as sort of this mixture of Neo-Pythagoreanism and Enochian Judaism. And they were not a monolithic group. There's a lot of diversity within the Essene movement. But Qumran could only support about 300 to 400 individuals at any given time. But we're told in historical documents there were 4,000 Essenes. So obviously, Qumran was a small minority sect of Essenes. Okay, it was about 10% of the Essene population. Right, and the sectarian literature we find, the majority of it, from Qumran is not representative of the overall larger Essene movement. Okay, there's a lot of good stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls, don't get me wrong, but unfortunately, there's some stuff in there that doesn't really align with what we find in the writings of Philo and Josephus or the community rule. So you can see an evolution occurring in the sectarian literature, especially if you compare like the community rule, which was very early, one of the earliest texts, to something like the temple scroll or war scroll, which were far later. Something happened. There's, most scholars believe that this so-called Zadokite priesthood kind of took over later and changed a lot of what was happening in Qumran and all of that. Okay? Not to say that they were all bad either. Okay? Like I said, a lot of good stuff in a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the community rule, okay, is one of the oldest scrolls. I think it predates the Qumran settlement. And I believe it is the most representative of all the Dead Sea Scrolls for the original Essene movement, the Nazarean Essenes, if you want to call them that. This is the group that Yeshua and John the Baptist come out of. Okay? And so the community rule best represents, best aligns with the group described by Philo and Josephus in their historical documents, more so than what we find from the majority of the sectarian literature found in Qumran. All right? So the original Essene movement was referred to in the earliest Dead Sea Scrolls as the congregation, or ha-ribim. After democratic beginnings, with the congregation, the community, literally the many, as such forming the supreme authority, testified to by what seems to be the earliest formulation of the communal constitution from the Cave 4 manuscript of the community rule. I inserted that there. The sons of Zadok, the priests, members of the Zadokite high priestly family, took over the leadership of the sect. Okay, that comes from the book, The Complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English, by Penguin Publishing. Highly recommend getting a copy of that book. Has all the Dead Sea Scrolls in it. And the author admits that the sons of Zadok, the priests, took over the leadership of the sect. Okay, this is, I'm not making any of this up. This is agreed upon by people that have looked into this for decades and spent their entire life studying all this stuff. These are not my opinions. All right? So in other words, we have this group, we can call them the Nazareans, Nazarean Essenes, right? That is very similar to what Philo and Josephus describe in their historical documents, very similar to what we find in the original, earliest manuscripts of the community rule as found in Cave 4 in Qumran, okay? And they simply referred to themselves as the congregation. They were more democratic and all of that, okay? They shared all their wealth. In the later Dead Sea Scrolls, you were only required to share a small portion of your wealth with the group, so they were not full communalists later on. Early on they were, all right? And we know that the early Christians were also full communalists, okay? And in the community rule, they're vegetarian and opposed to animal sacrifice. And it does seem like later on, in some of the other Dead Sea Scrolls, they were okay with animal sacrifice and all that. Okay, not to the extent that was going on in the Jerusalem temple. Okay, don't get it twisted, but they, and of course the archaeological evidence does show that there were some, burnt animal bones found in the Qumran ruins. We know this, hundreds. Okay, so it does look like later on, again, later. We're talking like probably from maybe, I don't know, 10 BC onward, there was some kind of shift. Something happened there. All right. And we can call them, the sons of Zadok, possibly. There was new leadership that took over the Qumran settlement, changed some things. And again, they weren't all bad. Okay. They also taught a lot of good stuff and preserved some of those earlier traditions that we find in the community rule. But there was some kind of shift there, right? These things happen. There's schisms and, in every religious tradition and all of that. It's okay. It is what it is. But that community rule, especially the earliest variant that we find in Cave 4, preserves the earliest tradition, which aligns best with the group described by Philo and Josephus in their historical documents. Okay, so multiple copies of the community rule have been discovered in the caves. In the manuscript found in Cave 4, there are some important differences from the other manuscripts all found in Cave 1. According to Vermes, the most significant peculiarities of the Cave 4 manuscript are the almost complete absence of the full spelling characteristic of the Qumran sectarian manuscripts, the different opening line, and a repeated failure to mention the priests, the sons of Zadok. For both its occurrences in the Cave 1 scroll, the Cave 4 scroll simply reads the congregation, Harabim. This alternative reading is likely to possess important historical implications. Of course, they don't tell you what those important historical implications are, but obviously someone redacted this text and inserted sons of Zadok and all this stuff, okay? Which again, that group, taught a lot of really cool stuff. Okay, so I'm not, putting them down or anything like that, but all I'm saying is that the more primitive variant from Cave 4 preserves the earliest layer of Essene tradition that was later modified by later groups and later leadership and all of that. Okay? So we can reasonably conclude that the community rule is an authentic pre-Qumran Essene document based upon the evidence from the Cave 4 manuscript. The later Cave 1 manuscript was redacted by Zadokite priests in Qumran who added the priests, the sons of Zadok, in place of the original and more inclusive congregation. The community rule is opposed to animal sacrifice and meat eating, whereas other Dead Sea Scroll sectarian texts condone animal sacrifice and meat eating in certain places. Okay, that's a very important difference. Also, again, the communalism. The earlier group, they were required to share everything in common. They had no private property at all. Okay, the later group, you just had to give a small portion of your private property. But all of these groups also they practiced ritual baptismal purification in the living waters. They all practiced that. Okay, which they believed had replaced animal sacrifice as a way to repent and atone for your sins. So baptism for the remission of sins versus animal sacrifice for the remission of sins, which was being practiced in the temple. They're basically all opposed to that. So the community rule, written by the original Essenes, who were vegetarians, pacifists, communalists, and opposed to animal sacrifice and slavery, was a source for the author or authors of the Didache, which represents the theology and belief system of the pre-Pauline early Jewish Christian church, the original tradition. Okay, so we can draw a clear historical thread going all the way back to, scholars say 150 BC, or BCE is when the original community rule was written. I would take it back even a little bit further than that, because we know Qumran started to be inhabited heavily around that time, but I think that they had brought that scroll there with them, and that actually is probably a little bit older. Okay, So let's say between 200 and 150 BC is when the original community rule was written by the original Essenes or Nazarean Essenes. Okay? And that tradition continued on amongst the larger Essene population, probably preserved in Mount Arbel and those cave complexes that we find in Mount Arbel, okay, near the Sea of Galilee. We know there was an Essene community there. And so I believe that John the Baptist and Yeshua come out of that northern group of Essenes, closer to this, Damascus, Transjordan, Sea of Galilee, the Upper Jordan and all that. That's where John the Baptist was baptizing as well, just below the Sea of Galilee and the Upper Jordan, right across from Pella and some of these other places, all right? And so I believe that John the Baptist and Yeshua were highly influenced by this northern group, of Nazareans, Nazarean Essenes that had originally composed the community rule. That represents the original community. Philo and Josephus were writing about that group, not so much the group that was in Qumran during their time. Because again, that group had shifted their emphasis, shifted their focus, shifted their leadership a bit, and modified some things, some important things, okay, that we need to take into account. Again, the Essenes were not monolithic, they were very diverse, and so we need to understand that, all right? But anyway, so that community rule was because it preserves the two ways tradition, okay? It has the two ways in it, so that was used as a source text for the Didache. Okay, most scholars agree on this, that whoever wrote the Didache knew the community rule. They used the community rule as a source text to write the Didache. Now, why would they do that if they weren't part of the same group? If they weren't trying to preserve that tradition, why would they include material from the community rule in their text? So it makes sense that the Didache, the authors who composed the Didache, were a continuation, you see, of these Nazareans, these original Essenes. Okay? And so, again, we can draw this clear historical line going all the way back to 200 BCE, all the way forward to 70 AD. So that's, 270-year period of time, and it's the same group. Okay, so the authors of the Didache knew of the community rule. They were using the community rule, and they used it to compose the Didache. They used that two ways material from the community rule and the Didache, all right, because they were inheritors of that same tradition. In other words, Yeshua was an Essene. He was a Nazarean Essene. John the Baptist as well, all right? And so they were leaders within that group. Yeshua took it to a whole nother level. He was on another level, y'all, okay, that we haven't really seen since, okay? I've become convinced, look, I make no secret of the fact that, I love some of the Eastern traditions. I've taught yoga for the past 15 years, heavily. Still teach yoga and pranayama and meditation and all that. Never been into Hinduism, not a big fan, won't lie. But I enjoy the techniques of that tradition of yoga because they're highly effective. They work. So if you want to grow closer to the divine, you can practice these techniques. Also the contemplative prayer practices from the Christian tradition, the Christian monastics, the Desert Fathers and all that. They're wonderful. So I use all of that in my spiritual practice and I teach it. It's all good stuff. Okay? But so anyway, I've studied Buddhism in depth, studied yoga in depth, and studied Judaism, Islam. Islam I have not studied in depth, but I have taken classes on it. It's part of my master's degree and all that. But I'm here to tell you, I think Yeshua was the true prophet, as he's known in the Clementine literature, in the recognitions and homilies. He's known as the true prophet. He was the Messiah. He was the anointed one. I believe he was the most enlightened being to have ever lived here on this planet. And as I read his teachings and the New Testament and study his parables in depth, and the Gospel of Thomas especially, I just uncover layers of deep, profound meaning in every teaching that he delivered. So I'm firmly convinced that he was the true prophet. He was the true messenger of God. He had the message, and we ought to be following his teachings and following the way. And again, he inherited the way, but he took it to another level. And so the Didache preserves a lot of this original tradition and teaches about the two ways, the way of life, the way of death. The way of life is the way of Yeshua. It's the way. Okay? But that way comes from this earlier Essene tradition. Okay? But again, Yeshua took it to another level. But it's all the same group. The Essenes, the Nazareans, the Ebionites. There's a clear through line historically from the community rule to the Didache. And so we have these beautiful texts that we can look to as sacred scripture as part of our tradition. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please share it with like-minded souls. Lots of love. Many blessings.